The story I want to talk to you about today is actually not me, but my father when he was just a little boy. See, him and his family used to go camping at the Lake of the Ozarks in Missouri. His family would go there for fishing all weekend since it's a pretty hot recreational spot, as well as occasional camping and barbecuing, and all that other stuff. My father tells me it was a pretty regular occurrence of him and his family going there, and he has a lot of fond memories growing up there. He tells me that's the lake that his father taught him how to fish, and when he was older, as a teenager, his dad first taught him about girls. He told me since he had gone there so much growing up, that he never really experienced anything out of the ordinary, but there was a few times in which he would describe this tall, white-looking dog watching him. My dad recalls one time specifically when he was just 8 or 9, and he had gone off into the woods to go pee, and he had looked up, and a few trees away was this white, wolf-looking head looking at him. My father said he froze right where he was, but this thing just kept staring at him from behind the tree. My dad slowly zipped up and slowly backtracked. He had told his mom and dad about it several times, but neither of them really gave him much credit or attention for that matter. He told me that there would be other times where he'd be playing in the lake and would get a really ominous feeling, like something bad was about to happen, and it would make him want to go home. There would be times he would be sitting there not wanting to do anything because of just this overwhelming sensation that something really awful was going to happen. His parents could never understand why, and he tried to play it off like he wasn't feeling good, or that he was sick just to avoid questioning, since they gave him a hard time about it earlier. A couple years later, when he was either 11 or 12, he was looking through the woods for some sticks and kindling to start a fire with back at camp, when everything around him suddenly got dead quiet. He began feeling nervous and acting strange, and he wanted to get out of there quickly. So he dropped a small pile of wood that he had in fear that something would happen, and ran back to the camp, telling his dad that he wasn't able to find anything. He says a lot of the times things only really happen when he wanders off into the woods, whether it be wanting to explore, hike, use the bathroom, etc. But he had mentioned multiple times that even when he was out playing by the lake and with his family, the feeling of dread would still overtake him, but yet wouldn't seem to affect anybody else, and his parents never seemed to sense anything. He's told me that he's never smelt anything weird, or never really seen anything weird besides the white-looking wolf head behind the tree watching him as he went to the bathroom. Since he grew up around there, other friends he went to school with had also visited that same lake frequently, and had other similar eerie experiences, but nothing necessarily more earth-shattering than what he had already experienced. When I ask him about it now, since he's an older guy, he doesn't really have much to say about it other than weird freaky stuff does go on there, and he's not really sure or has an explanation for anything. He ended up going to college in a different state, and never really returned home to Missouri, so he hasn't really been back since to that specific lake. But he says that he's sure that stuff still goes on, as things had gone on and off the whole time he had grown up there. The last thing he shared with me about his experiences is that he thought this was really strange and it disturbed him. Him and his family went camping with the neighbors next door. The neighbors also had a dog, a Labrador. Well, during this camping trip, he believes it was a weekend camping trip, since they stayed the night several days, and the only times they ever stayed the night for several days was on the weekends. So, this family at night had let their dog out to go to the bathroom. They trusted their dog to come back, and she usually always did. But one night she wandered off into the woods to go use the bathroom, and she never came back. The neighbors in my family thought that was weird since they were the neighbors. We were pretty familiar with their Labrador. After about 30 minutes, we decided to go out looking, even though it was dusk and dark. But we couldn't get really far since we didn't really have flashlights at the time. But I remember my neighbors kept calling her name, and and figured maybe she had just gotten stuck in the woods somewhere a little bit. I'm not sure. I honestly can't remember the reason why they blew it off and decided to wait till the following morning to go look for her. If it was my dog, I would be out there searching in the dark no matter what. But apparently, our neighbors weren't too terribly bothered by the fact that their dog wasn't quite responding to its name, and it had been well past 30 minutes at this point. Come the following morning, there's absolutely zero trace of the dog. They even both hike about a mile or so in the woods and can't find a thing. A little distraught and disheartened, they figure that maybe she had just ran away, or maybe some other family had gotten a hold of her and decided to take her home. There really wasn't much done about it, and I'm not really sure why. But again, being a kid, I wasn't fully aware of all of their emotions and maybe what they went through once they got back to the house. But I do find it weird that not only did the dog disappear, but that they weren't even bothered by it. Maybe they knew something. I'm not quite sure. He's also informed me that I guess there's been a few missing persons throughout the area in the last 10 or 20 years, or so I've been told. With the weird activity going on in the area, I am not quite surprised. Usually, things like this and disappearances seem to go hand in hand, and it wouldn't surprise me if there was a dogman in the area that my father had ran into and experienced firsthand. It was very late at night, and I was in the process of driving home from a long East Coast road trip. I was currently in Idaho, and I couldn't tell you what road I was on at the time. This was back in 91 or 92, I think. It was right after Metallica's The Black Album had just come out. I remember that because I was blasting it in my car the whole way. I had already had multiple cups of coffee, and was very easily and quickly losing my ability to stay awake at the wheel. I remember I pulled off to a side out of the road. Now, the road I was on was only a 2-lane highway, and it was a little bit more off-trail, so to speak. It was much more rural, I remember at the time, and there was a lot of dense forest around where I was. Anyway, as I was in the pullout, I decided I would get a few hours of shut-eye, so I turned off my car, pulled back my car seat, and lifted up my legs onto the steering wheel, and tried to sleep as best as I could. I'm sure many are wondering how I could have done this, but I'm a really short person. I'm only 5'2", so spreading out wasn't as hard as some of you might think it to be. Well, I remember I drifted off at some point, because the next thing I remember, I kept hearing this tapping on the glass. It's like if you took dog claws and began tapping the glass slightly, in weird sporadic patterns that didn't make any sense. I was drifting in and out of sleep since it was enough to kind of wake me up somewhat, but I wasn't opening my eyes because I wasn't quite sure what it was. This went on for a couple of moments, I would guess, and eventually I opened my eyes, and in my horror, I see this massive German Shepherd looking at me through the window. Except this German Shepherd was pitch black and had amber eyes staring intently down at me. This thing had been tapping on the glass and was apparently standing on 2 legs. I was screaming and just kept screaming as this thing just stared at me for a moment. I've never seen an animal look so intently at me, let alone look deep into my soul like this thing's eyes did. I thought it was just some dog at first, but I could tell it wasn't just a dog. It acted so different. The way this thing moved, the way it even breathed, the way it stared into me, told me that it was something unnatural. It also didn't help that this thing's face was pressed right up against the glass, watching me like a trapped rat, ready to pounce and eat its prey. After maybe no more than 10 seconds, this thing pulled its face away from my driver's side window and began to walk towards the back side of my vehicle. I had no idea what was going on, so in sheer panic, I fumbled my car keys, stuck it in the ignition, and turned the car on, and I put that thing in drive so fast and flew out of there you couldn't even believe it. As I pulled away quickly, I didn't even bother looking in my rearview mirror, or even my side mirrors. I didn't want to risk my brake lights illuminating what I might see. But who knows? Maybe I'm crazy. Maybe there was just a loose black German Shepherd that had amber eyes that wandered in my car for whatever reason. Although this was much larger than an average German Shepherd, if I recall. I just remember the head being humongous, and with it pressed against my driver's side window like that, it was like it was drooling over me, like it wanted me. But at the same time, the way it stared at me, it's like it wanted to tell me telepathically its intent was to hurt me, and it wanted me to be scared. Like it wanted me to know I was powerless and could do nothing to stop it if it wanted to kill me. The sheer terror this thing invoked in me was unheard of, and I've been around many dogs in my lifetime, and never once have I had any sort of feeling of dread or pure evil like this thing let out. I don't know why it didn't just rip me out of the car and kill me right then and there, because it easily could have. Even though my car door was locked, I am sure if it was strong enough, it could have broke through the glass and make me disappear so nobody could find me or any trace of me. Why it chose to pull its face away and walk towards the back of my car? Well, I'm not quite sure, and I have no idea what its plans were, whether they were benign or malicious. I'm glad I pulled out of there fast enough not to find out. I don't know how many others have had similar experiences to the story I just told you, but I haven't really met anybody or talked to anybody really about this encounter, so I thought I would share it with you so you could share it with people and who might have had a similar story happen to them. Part of me likes to look back and try to convince myself I was just so sleepless I hallucinated it, or that I was on some bad trip from drugs or something, even though I wasn't even on drugs at the time of the encounter. Sometimes I think back and think that maybe it was just a deformed bear or some angry dog, but I try to put all these pieces together and I can't just quite fit exactly what happened to me and what I experienced. The part that still gives me nightmares to this day was the tapping on the glass. It was such a light, gentle tapping, like it wanted me to wake up to it. Like it wanted me to know, hey, I'm here, and I can get you. You need to be scared. I feel like if it was trying to get into my car, it would have been clawing at my window, or trying hard to get in and break the window. But it didn't. It acted so calm, and it taunted me. I'll always hold that fear in me that it'll happen again. My granddaddy was bluff charged by some sort of upright walking canine back many years ago. See, my grandfather loved to go out into the Blue Ridge Mountains and just look for antlers and any sort of things he could find. He was an avid collector of knickknacks and such, and one of his favorite pastimes was going out into the wilderness and seeing what he could find. This man had just about everything you can think of, from obsidian arrowheads to fully intact skulls of bears. It's like there was nothing this man could not find. And he would go everywhere. He would crawl into tight crevices. He would spelunk down into caves to find stuff. He would climb up to the tops of trees to get stuff even. The man was crazy, but his adventures told so many stories, and he had found so many cool things. Among all the searching, though, he has had a few strange occurrences with animals that he cannot fully explain their existence. He tells me there were a couple times that he's pretty sure he ran into Bigfoot. And the most haunting time for me was when he told me that he was bluff charged by some strange upright canine. He told me that he had come upon a small stream in which he was filling up his canteen when he had heard rustling noise about 10 to 20 feet to his right. He looked, and out behind a tree stepped this really shaggy upright canine. My grandpappy told me that he immediately felt fear and went to draw his weapon, and that this animal seemed aggressive already and was watching him intently, especially his hand, since it was moving towards his weapon. He tells me he's not really sure if he stumbled upon this animal's territory or why it acted so aggressive, but he wasn't going to take any chances since he has had several close calls with moose and other large dangerous animal when he was younger. He went to draw his weapon, and this thing began charging at him. My grandfather threw down his canteen and bolted. He said he could tell right off the bat that it wasn't a full-on charge, and that it was a bluff charge, because he said he sensed that it wasn't moving near as fast as it could, but enough to drive out my grandfather out of the area like it intended to. Even though it did really spook him, he always reassured me when he recounted the story that he probably just stumbled upon some unknown animal's territory and had come too far into the zone and was maybe close to females. He recounts this animal as being about as tall as he was and pretty lean and lanky. He's also pretty cautious about where he travels along the Blue Ridge Mountains now, even though this took place 30-40 years ago. Okay, I'm sharing this story in hopes of someone else having another one, and I then will have this one out in the open. I was traveling Highway 10 from the west coast to the south coast of Florida. I was with my 6 kids and pulling a trailer with all of my belongings and 3 dogs in it. I was in a big SUV, and it was around 2 in the morning. The kids were asleep, and my 13-year-old daughter was in the passenger seat to make sure I stayed awake. So, after traveling Highway 10 for 3 days, I decided since we reached Florida, we would cut through the state just to save some time. So, we got off Highway 10 on an off-road in hopes of getting gas and making up some time. It was along Route 27. We came to the first little gas station. It was closed. I was nervous because we needed gas, so we continued on. I told my daughter to keep an eye out for deer crossing the 2-lane, deserted highway, because hitting a deer could kill us all and turn us over due to the trailer we were pulling. We were traveling around 45 miles an hour. I remember this so clearly, like it was yesterday. We had our brights on because the road was dark and winding. A few houses were on that highway, but not many. As we came around a corner and the headlights on the road, there was a lot of blood. Fresh blood. I couldn't believe what I was seeing. Where did all this blood come from? And on the side of the road was this 6 or 7 foot tall creature, if I had to estimate height. It was on its hind legs, hunched over a dead deer, eating it. It did not look up, not even when my headlights hit it. It was using its arms like a human, eating the deer. It had a very muscular body, pointed ears, and a long muzzle. If you ever saw a werewolf, this was it. It had a skinnier lower body and much more lean than I would expect, but used its arms and hands just like a human would. If it looked up, though, I would have died. I looked over at my daughter, and we were both seeing the same thing at the same time. Tears came to my eyes instantly, and at the same time, we both freaked out and said, "Werewolf." I sped up because I was scared it would run and jump on the trailer and kill my dogs. As we got about a mile away, my heart was beating so hard. My daughter and I were so freaked out. It was a werewolf. I have never been a believer in werewolves. I don't watch any werewolf movies or have any reason to make this up. And as a matter of fact, until today, I have only told a handful of people about this. This is a werewolf in Florida. Not sure of the exact town or road, but I wish I did know, so I can find out if we were the only ones to have seen this thing. I will live my life wondering. It was between Alabama to Florida, along the Panhandle. I will never forget this night. My name is Angela. I am a 47-year-old female from Idaho Falls, Idaho. I grew up in Idaho, and I am an avid animal lover, especially wolves since I was very young. I am writing to tell you about my dogman encounter when I was around 16 or 17 years old. It would have been around 1986 or 1987. Anyway, Myself and my friend, who's a female, and my other friend, who's a male, decided one night to go into our local cemetery and look for what is called the knocking grave and the werewolf grave. We found the knocking grave and discovered that it is just a loose board which vibrates back when you knock on the grave. We never found the werewolf grave, so we just chalked it up to it being a myth. We decided to go back to the car and were talking when the male and female friend of mine decided they wanted some alone time, since they were a couple back then. I got out of the car and decided to walk around the cemetery by myself. It was a beautiful night with a full moon shining above. Ironic, I know. I was walking along, looking at the old gravestones and thinking how sad it was that so many people are completely forgotten after they die, when I heard a strange sound to my left. I was standing near a mausoleum, looking down into another part of the cemetery. I heard the sound again and started walking towards it. It sounded as though something was crunching on something. I stood there for a minute, listening. I immediately noticed how quiet it had gotten in the cemetery, and the hair stood up on my neck and arms. Usually, there is noise from cars or dogs barking, or crickets, or something like that, but there was nothing. I then saw a silhouette of something big and black standing a little ways away from me, around 25 feet to be exact. Something told me to back away slowly and leave now, but I ignored it. I crept closer to the creature, never taking my eyes off of it. My eyes had adjusted to the darkness, and I could see very well, especially with the moonlight helping light up the night. What I saw terrified me, and also piqued my curiosity. The creature first looked like a huge wolf, but the front legs and torso were abnormally large, and the back legs were huge. It had a long furry tail behind it, just like a wolf's tail. The head was huge, and it had long pointed ears with stuffs of fur at the tips from what I could see, and it was leaning down and was eating something. The sounds I had heard was the crunching it made when it bit into whatever it was eating. I was excited because I had always wanted to see a wild wolf, and I thought that's what I was looking at. I figured that maybe a wolf had escaped the zoo, which was right next door to the cemetery, and had caught a rabbit or something. I realized, though, that the zoo didn't have a wolf in it, and hadn't had one in years. That made me even more excited and curious. I stared at the creature for about a minute or so. Then I shifted my legs to get more comfortable, and I must have stepped on a twig or scuffled my feet, because the creature suddenly stopped eating, looked up and turned its head my way. It then stood up on its back legs, and I heard a loud pop. And that is when I realized that this was not a huge wolf. It was black and had a few brownish streaks in its fur. When it stood up, I saw its head, chest, stomach, and lower body. The shoulders and chest were massive and covered in fur that tapered down as you looked down towards the stomach and legs area. It reminded me of a bodybuilder on steroids because of how muscular it was. As it stood there, it started to sniff the air, and it stopped and stared my way. The eyes were a deep orange gold and seemed to glow in the moonlight. It looked at me, and I felt a fear grow deep within me that I had never felt before. I knew it saw me, and I knew I had made a huge mistake by not leaving when I first got that bad feeling. It felt as though everything went cold, and this creature could see within my soul. It stared at me for a minute, and then it opened its mouth and it bared its teeth at me, as if it were smiling. The teeth were huge and yellowish white, and they looked very sharp, just right for ripping prey apart. It never took its eyes off me. It then lifted its arm and took one bite out of whatever it was eating. I then realized the sound I heard was it crunching bone and tearing flesh as it ate its meal. The hands were like elongated paws, and at the end of each finger were huge black claws that gripped the leg it was eating. I stood there watching it eat for what seemed like hours, when it could have only been a few minutes. He never took his eyes off me. The fear I felt overwhelmed me. I felt sick and I was visibly shaking, and so I did the one thing I had been taught to never do when confronted with a predator. I turned and ran as fast as I could back to the car. I didn't care. I couldn't get his eyes out of my head. And that smile. Those teeth. I could imagine it catching me and ripping me to shreds as I ran. I made it to the car though, flung open the door and jumped in screaming for my friends to start the car and get us out of here. They asked me what was wrong, and I just yelled at them to go now. They looked at me and saw the terrified look on my face, so the car was started and we left, and I never went back to that cemetery again. Later that night, I told both of my friends what I had seen, and they both laughed at me and told me it was just my mind playing tricks on me, which made me feel hurt and that they didn't believe me. But I could hardly believe myself. I saw a werewolf, or what is referred to as a dogman, and I will never forget it.